Brian, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's great to be here today. Really appreciate CTA TechCo inviting me to this event. I understand that I probably stand between you guys and lunch, so I'll try to keep this at a pretty good clip. I think it's a really cool merger between the two entities. You've got innovation, celebration. That's a pretty sweet combination. As Brian talked about, what I'd like to sort of go through and have a conversation about is the sharing economy, and in particular the role that millennials play with them. But I can't help myself, since I am indeed a recovering political consultant. I may try to relate it a little bit to the presidential campaign, if you'll allow me that leave. But look, everyone in this room are innovators. You spend a lot of your time, as we do, thinking not just about where the world is today, but where the world is going to be going. The last panel was just fantastic on that. At Airbnb, we certainly think about what those big mega trends out there that are really sort of driving the sharing economy. I think some of these will probably be pretty familiar to you, since you do spend time thinking about this, but let me tick through them quickly here. Our world is changing. That really is beginning with the nature of our people are changing. The millennial generation is going to represent the largest generation in history. And if you think about where they'll be by 2025, particularly when you connect them with Generation Z, this will be more than half of all workers, just about half of voters. And this is a generation with just different perspectives on the world, particularly compared to the boomer generation. This is a generation that really focuses on experience. They're more willing to spend money on experience than necessarily on a material good or material benefit. And you think about what's happening in America cities and really global cities, which is, for the first time since the 1930s in America, you have as many people moving into cities as are moving into the suburbs. That's the first in 80, 90 years. And that really is a function of how these millennials are living, and reflects the fact that they're looking for experience-based lives. The second massive change taking place is technology. Again, something that everyone in this room is obviously very, very familiar with. But think about it, there's more power in your device in your hand, than infinitely more power than was in the Apollo 11 rocket that took humankind to the moon for the first time. A generation ago, for boomers, the car was a liberating tool for them. It allowed them to move around in ways that they hadn't. For the millennial generation, it's these devices. They live, they work, they play, they connect over these people-to-people platforms. And it's just fundamentally changing how they engage with society. Not surprisingly, they love their technology. Well over 90% believe that technology gives them more opportunity. Over 80% talk about how it connects them with their friends and families. And so this technology is inherent into how they live their lives. Trend number 3 that we see out there is climate. The climate is changing. 15 of the last 16 years, hottest on record. Last year was the hottest recorded. This year will surpass last year. Each corresponding month this year has been hotter than the corresponding month last year. As a result of that, we're living in a time period where sustainability, particularly for millennials, is a huge issue. These are people, shared bikes, shared gardens, energy distribution, shared cars, shared housing. And look at where the millennials are on this issue. Basically a 20-point gap between how they view the issue of climate and how the baby boomers view the issue of climate. And what that means is that for this generation, sustainability is core to their existence. And so they look at things out there where there's underutilized assets that are not being used in a sustainable way. They recognize that 95% of the time a car is not being used. You look at housing, which is obviously the space that we're in. Over 13 million units of housing that are empty. Over 33 million bedrooms that are empty. Again, for a generation that has come up in a time period where sustainability is core to their existence, this is really relevant to them. And then the fourth massive change that's taking place out there is what's going on with the economy. Obviously, we have evolved from an industrial age into an information age economy. But the nature of work has begun to change as a result of that. Consider the number of people who have telecommuted at one point in time. It's a significant number in this country. If you look at the number of of folks who are now freelancers. A very, 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 very large number of Americans have been freelancers at one point in time, and that's particularly the case with millennials, and it is leading to a significant part of the economy. Again, a changing workforce and a changing nature of work. Suddenly, a lot of this was really impacted by the economic issue in 2008, the Great Recession. It had a real impact on how our economy is working, obviously. We commissioned a study by Gene Sperling, former economic advisor to President Clinton, President Obama, potentially future economic advisor to a future President Clinton. And he took a look at earnings and was able to document that since 2008 for the middle class, there has basically been a $7,000, a little bit more delta in terms of what they would have been projected to earn from what they're currently earning. Some slightly good news over the last couple of months, there has been a little bit of an uptick there, but nonetheless, you have a generation of folks who, over the last 8 years, are really in a fundamentally different place economically than they expected to be. For millennials, this has really impacted them from a debt perspective. When I was back in college in the early 90s, debt was at a fundamentally different level in terms of student education debt. It's now a 10x for today's millennials in terms of the debt that they're leaving college with, and that just has a huge impact on how they view the world. Related to the debt situation is also the fact that we're going through a transition in terms of the role of robotics and AI. Again, some of the stuff that I think you've probably talked about over the last few days. But that's having a real specific impact on a class of jobs called redundant jobs, jobs where there's routine skills that take place. Those are the jobs that are ultimately going to be really impacted, potentially displaced by the advances in AI and robotics. I think everyone has a responsibility to think about what this is going to mean for folks in the future of work. But it certainly is a significant thing. And if you consider the millennials, they're now in a time period where they have huge debt coming out of college. They're looking at employment opportunities that are just very different. There are studies out there that have suggested that almost as much as 50% of jobs out there could be replaced by robotics or AI. So a huge overhang for them. You put all of these elements together. You put the fact that the people are changing, that technology is changing, the environment is changing, the economy is changing. Those are all the magic sauce that went into the birth of the sharing economy, with the catalytic moment being the 2008 economic recession. And when you think about the sharing economy, it's important to recognize that there are sort of two different sectors. There is what I would call the labor sector, and that is folks who are literally sharing their labor, and the drive-sharing companies are an example of that. And then there's shared assets, and that's what Airbnb is, and that is taking an asset that's been underutilized, underused, and finding a way to generate economics from that. And so our company came about in 2008. I'll tell a little bit of the story about it. You had two millennials sharing an apartment in San Francisco. The company was ultimately founded by three millennials, but they were having a difficult time making their rent. And so they decided to put up a couple air mattresses when a conference was taking place in San Francisco to raise a little bit of money. They were able to do that. They made their rent. Light bulb went over their head that, hey, maybe this is a business idea. They then went to 50, 60, 70, I forget the exact number, but a huge number of VCs to see if they could get some seed startup money. And predictably at the time, people thought it was a crazy idea. Who's going to open up their houses? How can you scale a business like this? And so ultimately what they did is they actually took some cereal boxes, redesigned them. This was in the middle of the 2008 presidential campaign. One box was called Obama O's. Another box was called Captain McCain's. They sold those boxes. They maxed out on all their credit cards. They used that money to launch the company at the 2008 Democratic Convention in Denver. And boom, the company was off to the races. And it went from making sofas available, to making houses available, to making tree houses available, to making igloos available. And we even last week saw someone, this is sort of a true sign of the times, who took a taxi cab in New York and had converted it into a house and put it up on Airbnb. So if you want to spend a night in New York in a yellow cab, you're happy to, you're welcome to. And a growth from there has been really pretty significant. We're now in 35,000 cities. We're in 191 countries. It's often easier to identify the countries we're not in, places like Iran, Syria, North Korea. We're always looking for a volunteer for our first North Korean traveler, so let me know. And we passed, over the course of the summer, passed the 100 million mark in terms of number of folks who have traveled on Airbnb. And at the same time, our hosts, the people who open up their homes, continue to grow, over 2 million hosts. And one of the more interesting dynamics really over the last couple of years has been amongst our fastest growing cohort of hosts are actually senior women. They sort of track back to some of that earlier data. They have empty rooms in their home. Many of them are in fixed incomes. Some are trying to avoid reverse mortgages. And this has served both as an economic lifeline to them, but also as a social lifeline for them in their lives. Now, as we go forward, right, we obviously have a series of touchstones, and I'll just go through them. There's about 4 of them that we think about in terms of how we think about our continued economic success. The first one is just where the sharing economy is. Right now, it's at $15 billion. It's projected over the next 10 years to get to $335 billion. Right? So that's the first thing. We're in a space that looks like it's going to continue to grow and grow at a pretty significant pace. The second issue that we look at is just for us in particular, travel has been changing. My grandparents came to this country from different parts of the world via a ship like this, although this one's probably a little fancier than the one they were on. Today, their great-grandchildren, my kids, get to travel all over the world on planes. And then if you look at what air travel has done really since 1950 until today, you can see the continued acceleration of it. Over 3 billion people traveling by air, and air tends to be a pretty good proxy in terms of what's going on in the travel and tourism space. Look at the number of just pure tourists and how that trend line has gone since 1950. A really significant acceleration there. And what's interesting about both those trend lines, they basically match and align with one another. But what they really reflect is that through good times and bad, wars, recessions, what have you, there has continued to be more and more people traveling. And so that, in particular, what you're seeing with traveling is that millennials are big travelers. Almost 10%, let me actually come back to a quick factoid I had forgotten, which is if you look at where tourism is now today in terms of its economic impact globally, almost 10% of the GDP. That actually is almost twice as much as oil revenue that you saw in the last year. Just, again, giving you a sense of how big this space is and the fact that it's continuing to grow and some of the trend lines on it. Now, millennials tend to be a pretty significant subset of those travelers. They over-index in traveling. They like to travel internationally. The 200 million millennials account for almost $200 billion in travel. And based on survey data, the millennials say they want to travel more. That's where they want to spend their money. They'd rather spend their money on travel than on material goods. Again, tracking back to some of the earlier data about some of the cultural attitudes of millennials. The third category I would point to is we track to see how many people are actually engaged in the sharing economy and whether they like it. To date in America, about 72% of folks have used some version of the sharing economy or on-demand tools. But what's really interesting about it for us is the favorability and likability and how much they're enjoying that. Well over 80% say that it makes their lives easy. They say it makes their lives more affordable. They talk about the fact that it really allows them to connect in their community and with their friends and families in a different way. And finally, they like it because it is a tool that allows them to live a more sustainable lifestyle. And we've looked at the number of folks, particularly millennials, who have done home sharing, and the numbers are pretty significant in terms, particularly when you start to project out where this will go over the next 10 years. Over 70% of those between 25 and 34 have used home sharing, and about 67% between those 18 and 24. And so, again, you can see the trend lines in terms of where this is going. The fourth touchstone that we follow in terms of our continued growth and blessings and success is, are we delivering on a value proposition to society? Are we strengthening communities? And we believe we do so in 3 ways, but we track this really closely. The first is, democratizing travel. I think many of you may remember something that was called the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour was something that aristocrats had available to them in the 1800s and 1900s, where really the top 1%, top 1/10 of 1% would be able to travel through Europe and go to museums and stay at villas and have fine food. But it was really limited to a very, 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 very discrete segment of society. Now tourism, because of platforms like ours, is being opened up in a completely different way. I'll give you a little statistic from New York City, one of our top markets. We saw our fastest growth in New York City, over 70%, in those 50 zip codes in New York City that are, by census tract data, majority minority zip codes. These are places that historically have not benefited from tourism. Over $40 million generated in the last year in those zip codes. And there's a reason for this, or at least a partial explanation for it, and that is the nature of millennials in terms of their background. This is an exceptionally diverse cohort of people. 44% are folks of color, and so not surprisingly, they're looking to travel to different places and have different types of experiences. The second really critical value proposition that we need to deliver on is democratizing revenue. Many American cities, global cities, are facing significant fiscal constraints. We can help generate real revenue for them. We generate revenue in terms of bringing tourism to places that have historically not benefited, as we saw on the prior slide. But we also can generate real tax dollars. I'll tell you a quick little story. I was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, a large organization, represents most of America's big cities. And I stood there at an event in Washington, D.C. in January, and I got up there and I said, I'm going to do something that probably no private sector entity has ever done. Read my lips, we want to pay taxes. And it was sort of like silence in the room, and I had to say it again to really make the point. But it is something that we can do, and for cities that are facing real fiscal limitations, it is a significant revenue for them. We have done a little bit of an analysis. Over the last year, we've generated about $80 million. We know if we're paying taxes in the top 50 cities in America, that's about $200 million a year, $2 billion over 10 years. And cities are starting to use this money in really creative ways. I was particularly proud of the fact that we did a partnership with the city of Chicago earlier this year where we generated revenue for them that they are going to use to actually help pay for their homelessness challenge. And to us, that's a real interesting and smart way to use that revenue, a program that had not had sufficient funding that we're able to make available. Over the last year or so, we've done over 200 such partnerships globally, and almost on a daily basis, we are doing another partnership somewhere in the world to help generate revenue. And the third value proposition that we really have to deliver on is democratizing capitalism. So most of the Airbnb hosts, a typical Airbnb host is a middle-class person. They're making their home available about 47 times a year. That they take 97% of the money. So our economic model really channels the money down to the person, to the ground level. And as a result of that, they're making, the typical host is making about $7,500 a year. And you remember earlier we had gone through a little slide on how much money the middle class had lost, the Gene Sperling study that I had referenced. And if you take a look at the amount of money that we're generating, for those hosts who have lost this, we're helping to make up that gap. And so that's incredibly important that we deliver on that, and that's really the sort of core fundamental value proposition that we deliver. Now, earlier I had mentioned trying to bring in the presidential campaign on this. A lot of us are thinking about the value proposition in the context of the candidates. And as part of following the campaign, what has become very clear is that millennials are going to play an incredibly important role here, potentially a dispositive role in terms of who is the next president of the United States. The share of their vote, it's interesting. They right now have the same amount of potential voters or eligible voters as the baby boomers. In terms of actual voters or what they're projected to vote at, it's a little bit lower, but still a pretty significant, healthy amount. 27% of the electorate will be millennials. Now, millennials are going to be incredibly impactful in the swing states. We've actually gone and looked at where they are in the swing states. There's a significant number of swing states up in this election, and we've done some polling and research into it. But by way of context, in 2012, you could make the argument that Barack Obama was reelected president because of the millennial vote. In the 4 key swing states in that election, he carried 61% of the millennial vote. If Mitt Romney had actually split the vote and carried 50% of the millennial vote, he would now be President Romney. And so in this election, the millennials are potentially going to be the key swing vote. And there's a way to sort of look at it. There's been a number of polls that have come out in September showing where the horse race is. And when a head-to-head matchup between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Hillary has a pretty sizable advantage with millennial voters, which is giving her about which is helping to give her about a 4 or 5 point lead overall in the horse race. But when you do a four-way race, those millennial voters begin to migrate to other places. I think somewhat, again, reflective of their principles, their ethos, their values. And that lead then obviously dissipates pretty significantly. Now, we have to see how this plays out once you get to October and how are voters thinking about this. But in the first part of September, we have seen those horse race numbers get a lot closer in the four-way race because millennial voters are shifting in terms of who they're supporting. Now, so we dug into this a little bit and wanted to see, what is it that attracts millennial voters to a particular presidential candidate? Innovators in this room should be happy to hear this, which is that well over 80% of those millennials said that one of the key attractions to them for a candidate would be someone who embraces innovation, who's thinking about the future, who's forward-looking. We then went even below that and took a look at what their impression was of the sharing economy. Sharing economy in many ways is a signifier to this generation of innovation. Generally, voters across the board like the sharing economy. Millennials, in particular, over-indexed on it, and that was also the case in these swing states. And so we would posit that one way for a candidate to really be able to appeal to these voters, talk about innovation, talk about the sharing economy. We at Airbnb, and this is self-serving, but we wanted to see what those voters thought about us in the context of the campaign. Overall, really strong favorabilities, positives from voters. Again, not surprising, millennials had an incredibly strong view of us, and those views carried over to those millennials in the swing state. But we did focus groups and research to try to understand why those millennials liked us so much in the context of the presidential campaign and politics. And it's really interesting how it lined up with that value proposition that I had talked about earlier. They liked us because of what we're doing for the middle class. They like us because we're helping democratize tourism. They like us because it's helping people connect with their community. And so, we're I'm doing the math in my head, 47, 46 days away from the election. I think the events of this week have really reflected the challenges that we as a society, that we in America face. But all of you, and I began this conversation with this point, are also looking ahead to where the world is going. And as an optimist, I look at this data out there. I look at the trend lines. I look at some of this polling data. I look at some of the data that we see in terms of the growth. And I'm incredibly optimistic about where the world is going to go. When these millennials by 2025 really become the dominant force in society, they'll be more than half of workers, about half of all voters. I fundamentally think we're going to see some real significant shifts in terms of how our society works. On the political side, we've gone through 20-plus years of paralysis. That paralysis has reflected real divisions in the country. But you're going to have a generation here that's going to be the dominant generation that does share similar values, that does share similar principles, that does share a similar ethos about life. And it may be different, but there's a commonality there, and that really offers a promise of actually an era of consensus, of collaboration, and breaking through that paralysis that I think has really been a challenge for our country. I think in terms of how people work, we talked about some of the challenges that this generation is facing with debt, with robotics and AI. The flip of it is that there's going to be an explosion of potentially new jobs in the creative class and people-to-people activity. And those are jobs that people typically actually have much more positive experiences with and enjoy their work much more. And then the third, I think, big change that will take place will be really how people live. There's always been the Marshall McLuhan talking about the global village. I think we're going to end up with global villages. These are going to be places that are very sustainable and walkable, places that are incredibly diverse and inclusive, places where people really like to be with each other, spend time with each other. And so I think you project out 10 years from now, and we're going to be in a world where I fundamentally believe that anyone will be able to belong anywhere. And we at Airbnb are really excited about that future. We're really honored and love being in the middle of it and part of it. but do think that at the end of the day, this will be a great place for our country and really the world to end up. So why don't I stop there? Thank you very much for having me.